Hello, I'm Forbes Hawkins. I'm from Museum Victoria, which is in Melbourne, Victoria, which is the little white bit down the bottom there, and it looks quite small on the screen, but it's actually quite a large area. At Museum Victoria, it's kind of an umbrella body. So there are 4 venues really, but there's one kind of collection. We've got science collections, we've got Indigenous cultures collections, and we've got history and technology collections. And in Melbourne, there are some other large institutions as well. We've got galleries, we've got a library, you know, as you do in most large cities. And in Victoria also we have some other organisations. We've got local sporting clubs, we've got war veterans groups, we've got small museums, historical societies. There's something like 740 of them across the state of Victoria, perhaps many more than that. Now, unlike the big museums, these other museums, these small museums, the vast majority of museums operate on tiny budgets. Their collections are usually cared for by volunteers, usually older retired people, who know a great deal about their history and are very passionate and committed about their heritage, but they lack industry standard collection management and curatorial experience. Now in Victoria, somewhere around 60% of these museums have some sort of presence on the web. So that means 4 out of 10 of these museums don't have any web presence at all. That's quite a lot. But hang on a moment, because out of these, there are a whole bunch of organisations where the museums are only a part of that organisation, a sporting club, for example, or a veterans association, and the museum in that case is not the main activity. So whilst they may be mentioned on the organisation's website, the website isn't actually about them. In fact, fewer than 10% have websites that are dedicated to talking about the museum. Now, I'm guessing that this is similar in other places around the world, and perhaps none of this comes as a surprise to everyone, but I think it's good to remind ourselves that the vast majority of museums would actually find it quite difficult to engage in the sorts of conversations that we've been having here at Museums on the Web these past couple of days. And these small museums are not trivial. I mean, there's an awful lot of them, and there's only probably half of them represented in that graphic there. And we know that they have lots and lots of collection objects. In the state of Victoria, we know that there are at least 14 million cultural artefacts held by smaller museums. Perhaps many more than that. This number is getting up towards the combined holdings of all of those major institutions that we have in Melbourne. And we know that some of these objects are of great cultural significance, but we don't actually know much more than that, because as I said, very few of these organisations have the capacity to produce websites that describe their collections in any sort of detail. In fact, quite a few of them haven't got any collection documentation at all. Not all though. Some organisations have great documentation, they've got money and they can afford to buy really good professional collection management systems like AdLib or Vernon or whatever, but many don't have any documentation, just rooms full of stuff that a bunch of passionate folk have collected over the years. Nothing written down, maybe things on display are at the very least labelled, or maybe not. Maybe all that they know about their really significant cultural artefacts is in the head of an 80-year-old volunteer, or maybe they do have some documentation, but it's just a box of notes on a shelf, or maybe they were forward-thinking and went all digital in the early 90s, and now they're stuck with this 20-year-old Excel 4 document running on Windows 3.1 with a failing hard drive in the back office. And this is actually a really common story. And none of these collections are online, obviously. So almost all of the information about these millions and millions of collection objects is inaccessible and at risk of being lost altogether. These objects remain completely hidden from us. And when a blown hard drive or a power surge or silverfish or the death of a museum volunteer means that a small town community loses some of its cultural memory, it's a big problem. Documentation conveys meaning. Without stories, these collections become just stuff. A chair that belonged to a person who went on to found a city 150 years ago is, without the story, just an old chair. Documentation at risk means that these cultural artefacts are also at risk. Now, none of this is any sort of revelation, perhaps. Many of us in the museum community have been talking about this problem for years. Various people have done something about it. For example, in 2008, some of you might have seen a system called eHive, or actually NZ Museums, which uses eHive by Vernon Systems. It was set up in New Zealand by some of our colleagues there, and it's a really great project, and that seeks to address this sort of problem. And they presented a paper on this at a conference a few years back that some of you may have seen, and is still online. I'm sure there are other examples around the world, but I'm not actually aware of any. And I was speaking to Jack earlier, and we were both wondering if anybody else was aware of any systems that sought to address this issue. In Victoria, we've been talking about it for years as well. And then one Saturday in February 2009, a day that in Melbourne, in Victoria, we remember as Black Saturday, a series of bushfires killed 173 people and destroyed vast amounts of property across the state. It was huge and it was terrible. It was actually very close to my house. And amongst all of that devastation, a few museums and historical societies lost their collections, and they lost any record that those collection items had ever existed. Not only were the towns destroyed, but their cultural memories were also lost. Now, summer bushfires are a way of life in Australia. They happen every single summer, and when I get back from here, I've actually got to start preparing my house. But the bushfires in 2009 were of an unprecedented scale. We live in a rapidly warming world. Bushfires, storms, floods, climate modelling indicates that these things will become more commonplace in years to come. The Black Saturday event served to remind us of the risks to our undocumented collections. It's hard to develop a disaster management plan if you don't have any records of what it is you're trying to manage. And if your documentation can't be backed up off-site, that's a big risk. So after talking about it for years, Museum Victoria partnered together with the Victorian branch of an organisation called Museums Australia. And Jack told me that the equivalent organisation in the US is AAM. I'm not sure if there are similar organisations here in Asia and Europe. I'm sure there are. Anyway, Museums Australia Victoria provides support, training, accreditation, and a bunch of other really fantastic services for museums in Victoria. They know the people who work within the small museums community, and they have their trust. And they have experience training people who work for museums. Museum Victoria, on the other hand, have a long history of innovation in online and collection information management system development. So between us, we thought we could begin to address this problem. We applied for funding to build something that we called Victorian Collections. Now, the core of it was to be an online collection information management system and website. But knowing that our target audience were older folk with, generally speaking, a relatively low level of technical literacy, we knew that we would need to train people to use the thing that we were going to build. We felt that the museums we were thinking of dealing with were unlikely to take it up unless they felt they were receiving support and guidance which was available on the end of a phone line. So Museums Australia Victoria started gathering up interested museums. They were usually those without systems of their own or a few that actually wanted to change. And they started developing the training program, and in the meanwhile, we got busy building the system. There were two bits we had to build. One was the collection information system, obviously, the back end, and then there was the public-facing website. Essentially, we're building a content management system, but it was one very much geared towards museum information system management. Now, the design of a collection management system for a host of elderly volunteers was a journey in itself, and I won't talk about that here. Designing the website was pretty tricky too. You see, we were starting with no contributors and no content. And it occurred to us that if we pulled together a bunch of content which was going to be written largely by people with little writing or collection management experience, no experience in digitisation, photography and so on, and we all put it on a big, nice showcase website, there was a risk that it might look really, bad. We just didn't know what we'd be dealing with. At the same time, we knew that we needed to focus on selling the idea of Victorian collections to coax museums to get on board. Quite a few of these little museums are fairly conservative and fiercely proud, And we needed them to really want to be a part of this, not to feel like it was being imposed upon them. So we kind of spent our time thinking, I guess, a lot more about how to sell the idea to organisations, and maybe not quite so much in how to present their content. In fact, we were, if anything, a little nervous about presenting their content before we'd seen it. We wanted it to be available, but perhaps not the sole focus. So this is what we came up with. And this website sold the idea really well. It was very successful as far as that goes, but it didn't provide a great collections online experience. You can find stuff if you go to the website now and you click on the search page, you just get an empty search box. It's actually quite hard to dig in and get to content. They're a few clicks away. But anyway, we got a bunch of museums on board and we started travelling all over the state, holding full-day workshops. They covered not only cataloguing in Victorian collections, but also more fundamental things like how to write about the significance of collections, how to take images of objects, how to respond to user-generated comments. Many organisations didn't have computers or broadband, so we loaned laptops, wireless dongles and cameras to get them started. And all of that, the system, the training, the loan equipment, we provided free of charge. They have no money, but their cultural collections are valuable. If we charged them, nothing would get catalogued. So there was a lot of hand-holding to start with, but we imagined that over time organisations would build up enough internal knowledge and experience, and sooner or later we'd reach a point where we could drop the support off a little, stop holding their hands quite so much. We kept the system really simple. We wanted it to be industry grade. We wanted it to be very functional, and remember there were a lot of organisations that actually were very, very capable and very cluey and had big collections and had money. So it had to suit them, but you know, we had to balance things out a bit. And you know, we imagined we produced training videos and that sort of thing. And we thought that over time that need for the ongoing physical training and face-to-face contact would diminish. Now, that was a bit over 3 years ago. Where are we now? Well, we have about 260 active organisations. They've catalogued over 20,000 objects. We've conducted over 100 training sessions right across the state. We go to them. We don't make them come to us. And we have many hundreds of people who are actively cataloguing. Some organisations manage one object a month. One organisation recently uploaded several thousand objects into the system. We're seeing a richness and diversity in the content, and we feel that the site that we built is actually now really letting us down. We now have some stuff to show and we want to show it, so we've redesigned the site to look like this. It's all responsive and nice, and hopefully we'll be up before the end of the month. I was working really, really hard to get it up before this conference. It didn't quite happen. Very hard, lost a lot of sleep. But anyway, as you can see, we've completely dropped the sales pitch. It was probably unnecessary in the first place, actually. Now it's all about content, just the content, and I think it's a big improvement. And I actually wish we'd been bold enough to do this from the start, because, as it turns out, it looks pretty good. Even, I think, the badly photographed stuff seems to kind of work. I mean, there's photographs with numbers and crinkly drop sheets and overlays and logos and all sorts of things, but it kind of looks okay. We really didn't expect that, except, of course, in an environment like this, folks are always going to get a little creative and find ways to communicate something in a bad way. Now, this was interesting because the organisation in question was receiving comments and someone was trolling them and saying, oh, this is rubbish, you haven't got enough images up there, you've got all these objects but not enough of them have images. And they got really stressed about it, so they started adding this message, uploading it as images to all of those objects because they wanted to stop the trolling. They just didn't know how to cope with it. And, you know, there are other examples. In this case, someone's catalogued some audio recordings and they thought it would look better on the website if each had an image. So this is what we ended up with. Oh, the slides cut off a bit there, sorry. So in this case, you know, I guess we could call the collector and offer some professional advice to the effect of, hey, you're making our website look really bad. Should we? Is that our role? It's their data. Shouldn't we just provide the tool and get out the way after we've trained them? Or, you know, should we keep looking over their shoulders? We never thought about moderating content, but then if collectors fill pages with images like these, it looks really dreadful. So it seems like we might need to keep providing guidance. And it would seem training too, because 3 years later, the demand for training is still huge right across the state. We're still running training sessions where people come in, sit down and turn on a computer for the very first time in their lives. They've never used email, never used a browser. By the end of the day, though, they've catalogued their first records and uploaded images. We've found that there are numerous barriers to the process of cataloguing, including overstretched and elderly volunteers, low levels of computer literacy, poor provenance information associated with collection items, a lack of understanding of the concepts of significance, and poor research skills. For these people, technology can easily get in the way. These are complex issues for community organisations to address, so they need all of the help they can get. And the sense of worth and value that is provided to each of these volunteers during our visits and training sessions is important to them. The other day, one of the Museums Australia folk emailed and asked me to help someone who needed their password reset. And I do get these emails from time to time from them because they forget themselves kind of how the system works, and I'm buried in the technicalities of it, and sometimes I get a bit frustrated. As I've told you, you know, they click on the link, they reset their password, it sends them an email, and it's all easy, it's standard. You know, that's how all websites work. And they said, well, this woman doesn't use other websites. And I said, what do you mean she doesn't use other websites? And they said she's 89 years old. Right? Exposure to the sometimes harsh world of online feedback has been challenging for some organisations too. They've never had to communicate using online comments before. Email is a metaphor for a real world thing that they're familiar with, but comments are weird. You know? It's an unfamiliar way to converse, and we've had the occasional troll, as I've mentioned. And for big museums, when you see that sort of thing, you hit the delete key and forget about it, but for an 80-year-old volunteer putting their heart and soul into preserving heritage, one nasty comment can be quite devastating. So at the beginning, we really thought the need for training, guidance, encouragement, hand-holding would drop off over time. And it turns out that we were completely and utterly deluded. We fell into that age-old stupid trap of, hey, let's do this really big thing and make everything great, and then we're done and we can move on to the next thing. The reality is that it's not possible to run a program like this without ongoing face-to-face contact and personal support. We provide a tool that... look, sorry, I just have to apologise for invoking that. I could just see tweets coming in. We provide a tool that helps a group of people to do really important work, but the community we're dealing with need more than that, more than we expected they would. We need to be prepared to work closely with this community and provide assistance, guidance and encouragement over the long term. Maybe in years to come, as technological literacy increases with this audience group, it'll be easier, we'll see. For now though, none of the organisations have money to pay us to hire staff, so we have to look at other sources of funding. And that means we need to think more carefully about how we measure our success so that we can demonstrate to our sponsors, or potential sponsors, that things are going really well. How do we do that? Well, as we all know, that's a really interesting question, and the answer is I don't know. And if anyone's got any advice for me, I'd really appreciate that. See, often when these sorts of projects are designed, we define performance indicators that are easy to measure because, well, you know, they're easy to measure. We tend to avoid indicators that we know we can't easily quantify because we don't have time or money to do that sort of research. Things like downtime, target dates, hits, support response times. These things are easy to log and report upon, and they're important. They're important things to know when you're in the midst of implementing a project. However, as projects move beyond implementation, those things can become less relevant. We know that web analytics and support logs say something, but how much of the real story do they in fact reveal? If you accept that museums directly benefit communities, projects like Victorian Collections have a huge role to play in the generation of social capital at the community level. But how do you measure the true impact of that? How do you report upon it? We can put a nice Google Analytics chart in a report and it looks great. It stupidly easy to generate a great looking chart of clicks and bounces. But what are these little dots? Well, maybe one of the dots there is where a woman named Bronwyn clicked on a page and found a photograph of a leather satchel owned by an Australian soldier during the First World War. She left a comment and clicked on a button and made that dot. She had a moving experience, and the collector learned a lot more about their object, and they've actually got an ongoing dialogue now. Turns out there are a lot of things in this organisation's collection that relates to this woman's grandfather's uncle. And it made her day, built their knowledge, all in that little dot. I'm sure lots of folk here have seen transactions like this many times before, those who work in online editing or comment moderation on their websites. But to a tiny community museum staffed by volunteers who might have been lucky once to see 10 visitors a week, the value of this sort of transaction can be enormous. It validates their work, it provides them with a very personal sense of self-worth, and it encourages them to continue. They become aware that they've gone suddenly from maybe 10 visitors a week to maybe hundreds or thousands. They become aware that they aren't hidden away in an old building in a backwater anymore. They're on the world stage. Or, you know, maybe Bronwyn's dot was a different dot. Maybe that was just someone clicking around. The fact is, we don't know. It might represent perhaps a highly significant action, or it might represent nothing. Evaluating and reporting on social impact is a complex task full of uncertainty and prone to subjectivity. To evaluate Victorian collections, we might need to start looking at comments, talking to users, talking to collectors, gathering stories, conducting social research about our own website, a little like a museum curator might do, doing kind of meta-research, researching the researchers. There are so many things we could measure. We could measure so many things in so many different ways with different outcomes. It could get pretty time-consuming and very expensive, and it kind of defeats the purpose, and none of us have time. So those are the sorts of things we now have to consider with this community collection management system that we've created. At the very least, providing case studies in our reports, as we are, provides a sense that there is something tangible and real behind the facts and figures. These guys are a bunch of volunteers who are restoring a particular type of long-range heavy bomber aircraft, and there's only a few of them left in the world. I think 3 left in the world, and one of them, in the midst of this, heard about Victorian collections and was curious and went along to a training session. They'd never thought of themselves as collection managers before, but the training motivated them. They went back and they set up a digitisation workshop in a corner of their aircraft hangar. They got a camera, they got some lighting, they got a backdrop, and they started digitising stuff about the things that people had donated to them. They began putting an airplane back together, but along the way they've learnt to catalogue our cultural heritage. Now maybe this is only a small impact on a very local community level, but remember that this is being replicated at lots and lots of museums right across the state. I'm incredibly excited about the future of Victorian collections. It's a fantastic project to work on, and it's a brilliant community to work with. I'm really excited to explore ways in which we can begin to use this data in an amalgamated way and to provide these museums with tools to allow them to interlink and to cross-reference. We can really harness this data in ways that would be quite a bit harder if we'd not brought these organisations together. I'm excited about new possibilities as we help them increase their ability to converse with each other and with their new global audience. Because each of these small museums is significant in its own way at a local level, but collectively they have national significance, perhaps even international significance. We need to better understand their weaknesses, but we should not underestimate their strengths. These guys are learning how to tell our story, and we need to help them do that. But in doing so, it seems to me that we need to become better at telling their story. Thank you.